Imagine a crowded Victorian marketplace. Air is thick with coal smoke, sweat, and the shouts of vendors selling pigs, boots, and stale bread. But today, something else is on display. Something the crowd finds even more exciting. A woman. She stands silent while a rope hangs loosely around her arm. Not tight enough to restrain her. Just tight enough to show she is being offered. Her husband holds the other end, tugging gently as if presenting livestock. People laugh. Some point, children stare as if this is normal, because in many towns it was. This is not fiction. This is not metaphor. This was Victorian wife selling, one of the darkest, most humiliating practices hidden behind the polished image of the Victorian era. The husband clears his throat. The crowd quiets, shouts the price. Sometimes a few shillings, sometimes a pint of ale, sometimes whatever a man could get. People gather closer. They inspect the woman's clothing, her posture, her age, even her teeth. Men mutter questions like, can she cook or does she drink? As if they are shopping for an animal instead of a human soul. Newspapers from the 1800s recorded these scenes with cold amusement. A wife was sold on Tuesday for 2 pots of beer. A man transferred his spouse for a price of 1 sovereign. The rope was placed around her neck, and the deal was finished. They wrote it like entertainment, not the destruction of a life. The woman being sold knew something the crowd didn't care about. She had almost no rights. A Victorian wife wasn't a legal individual. She couldn't own property. She couldn't start divorce proceedings. She couldn't even take her children if she tried to flee. So when her husband dragged her to market, she couldn't stop him. The law wasn't on her side. Society wasn't on her side. Sometimes even her family wasn't on her side. But here's the part that shocks us the most today. Some women wanted to be sold, because the only thing worse than being sold like cattle was staying in a marriage with no escape. A wife's sale might mean freedom from a violent husband. It might mean going to a man she actually cared about. It might mean a second life she could never reach through legal channels. But none of that mattered to the crowd watching. To them, it was just another spectacle. And as the buyer stepped forward, coins clinking in his pocket, the woman braced herself, not knowing whether her next chapter would be salvation or something much worse. What happened after the deal was made would reveal the darkest truth of all, and it's coming next. The moment the buyer stepped forward, the atmosphere in the marketplace shifted. The crowd pressed closer, eager for the moment everyone came to see the transfer. This wasn't just a handshake. This wasn't simply exchanging money. Victorian wife selling followed a strange, humiliating ritual that made the event feel like a twisted public ceremony. First, the husband tightened the rope, sometimes around his wife's wrist, sometimes her waist, and in the most degrading cases around her neck. It wasn't for force. It was symbolism. It meant ownership. It meant this woman is mine to dispose of. And everyone watching accepted it without question. Next came the announcement. A husband would shout something like, I hereby sell my wife, for she is no use to me, or I relinquish all responsibility. She is now his concern. Responsibility. That word was everything. Because in Victorian society, a married woman wasn't seen as a person. She was seen as a man's responsibility, financially, morally, socially. And the men who participated in these sales believed that if they publicly transferred her, then the burden of supporting her and controlling her would transfer too. It was a poor man's divorce. A desperate loophole in a system that made ending marriage nearly impossible. The buyer would step forward, inspect the woman like a piece of farm equipment, and either nod or shake his head depending on his judgment of her usefulness. If he agreed, he handed over the payment, sometimes a handful of coins, sometimes a few gallons of ale. Once even a dog, according to an 1832 newspaper report. The crowd cheered. Men laughed. Women watched silently, knowing it could easily be them next. Once the exchange was done, the husband released the rope, and the buyer took it. This moment mattered more than the money. In the eyes of the community, the act of giving and receiving the rope meant the marriage was over. Some buyers immediately untied the rope, wanting to show kindness. Others yanked it and pulled the woman away like property they had just won. But what about the woman herself? She stood there, heart racing, not knowing what kind of life waited on the other side. Some felt relief. Others felt terror. But all felt humiliation. And this wasn't rare. Historians found hundreds of documented cases. Some towns even had favorite spots for wife sales: livestock markets, town squares, even taverns. The ritual was so common that many believed it was legal. But here's the twist. It wasn't. Not at all. Yet the police let it continue. Why? Because the truth behind why Victorian authorities ignored these sales is even darker, and you will discover it next. You might think that the moment a husband dragged his wife into a marketplace with a rope around her waist, the police would intervene. After all, wife selling wasn't legal. It was never listed in any British law. No act of parliament ever allowed it. No official court ever recognized it. And yet it happened for more than a century, in public, in front of officers, without punishment. So why did the Victorian police ignore it? Because stopping it would have exposed something the government didn't. Want to admit, the marriage system of the Victorian era was completely broken. A real divorce required something nearly impossible for the working class: hiring a lawyer, appearing in a court, paying massive legal fees, and finally getting the approval of Parliament. A divorce could cost the equivalent of 2 to 3 years of a working man's wages. Only the wealthy elite could even attempt it. So what did the poor do? They created their own system, a brutal, humiliating public ritual that acted like a folk divorce, and the authorities knew it. To stop a wife sale was to trap a woman back in a marriage she had desperately tried to leave. It was also to force a man to support a wife he couldn't afford. Worse, it would expose that the country's official marriage laws were failing the majority of the population, so the police looked the other way. Witness accounts even describe officers standing at the edges of markets, casually watching the transaction. Some even chatted with spectators. They didn't step in because, in their eyes, the sale solved a problem. It kept peace in the home, reduced conflict, and relieved communities of marital disputes. But the truth was uglier. The police ignored wife sales because poor working-class women had virtually no legal identity. Male authorities didn't see them as individuals worth protecting. They were extensions of their husbands, and if a man wanted to give up that burden, it wasn't seen as a crime. Even local communities participated in the silence. A wife sale was treated like a community-approved breakup, a practical solution, an economic exchange sometimes. Even the wife's own family attended the sale and accepted it. In one chilling case from 1833, a woman's father watched her being sold and later declared, "It's for the best." To Victorian society, this was not an abomination. It was a convenience. But not everyone involved was eager or willing. Some wives walked into the marketplace already knowing their fate was sealed. Others were forced. And then there were the women who wanted to be sold. Their reasons were heartbreaking, and you'll see exactly why in the next part. To understand how disturbing Victorian society truly was, you have to imagine what marriage meant for a poor woman during that era. Once she was married, she existed legally only through her husband. Her wages belonged to him. Her children belonged to him. Her body, her labor, her entire life, all under his control. There was no court she could run to, no shelter, no police protection, no right to divorce him on her own. So for some women, being sold was the only way out. Imagine a woman living with a man who spends his nights drunk, smashing furniture and threatening her children. The neighbors hear it, they know. But everyone shrugs. A husband's home is his castle. If she leaves, she becomes a vagrant and loses her children forever. If she stays, she endures endless violence. Now imagine that same woman quietly arranging for another man, maybe a neighbor, maybe a friend, maybe someone she trusts to buy her during a wife sale. Yes, some wife sales were secretly planned by the women themselves. Historians found cases where a woman walked into the market willingly, stood straight and calm during the sale, and immediately left with a man she had already chosen. Years later, one woman admitted she had begged her husband to sell her because a rope and a market were less cruel than the life I had before. Even more shocking, not every husband resisted. Some agreed because selling a wife freed them too, from debt, from conflict, from a marriage neither person wanted. But this freedom came with a terrible price. The humiliation was public. Crowds jeered. Some men shouted crude jokes. Women in the audience watched helplessly, knowing they lived one drunken outburst away from being in her place. Not all wives found happiness at the end of a rope. Some were taken by men who promised safety but offered worse. Some were sold multiple times, passed from one household to another like worn-out property. One record from 1815 described a woman sold 3 times in 1 month. Even when a wife's sale led to a kinder household, the shame followed her forever. Communities whispered. Churches refused to recognize the new relationship. Children were labeled illegitimate even if the community approved the sale. Victorian society pretended it was moral, clean, and polite. But behind the lace, the corsets, and the sermons, families were disintegrating in dirty marketplaces while the world watched. And if you think the humiliation ended once the sale was done, wait until you see what happened after a woman was purchased. Because the next part exposes what married life looked like once she left the market, and why some wives faced even darker realities in their new home. When the marketplace noise faded and the crowd returned to its routines, the real story of a wife's sale began. Because once the rope changed hands, the woman was expected to follow the buyer, sometimes willingly, sometimes trembling, sometimes numb. The walk to her new home was the longest journey of her life. Every step carried a silent question: is this my escape or my new prison? Some men untied the rope to show kindness, letting her walk freely beside them. Others kept it tight, pulling her along like newly purchased livestock. For many women, those first moments revealed everything. A gentle hand meant safety. A jerk of the rope meant fear. But no matter what, there was no turning back. Victorian communities treated the transaction as final. The moment the rope exchanged hands, neighbors, police, and even families accepted the new arrangement. A wife's sale wasn't legal, but it was socially binding. And that made the buyer feel entitled to do whatever he wanted once she crossed his doorway. Inside her new home, several grim realities awaited her. 1. She had no legal rights. Again. Even after being transferred, the law still considered her married to the first man. But socially? Her new buyer was her husband. It was a nightmare contradiction. If he was kind, she could finally breathe. If he wasn't, there was no escape left. 2. She became financially dependent immediately. She had no savings, no property, and no way to earn money without his permission. Her survival relied entirely on the man who had just purchased her. 3. She might be expected to serve as a wife instantly. Victorian expectations were brutal and unspoken. A woman who entered a new household was assumed to cook, clean, care for children, share a bed. Some buyers demanded obedience the first night. Others waited, but the pressure was always there. 4. Children complicated everything. If she brought children from her previous marriage, problems exploded. Legally, the children still belonged to her original husband, the seller. He could demand them back at any moment. Some did. Others didn't care. But many children were caught in the middle, treated like property just as their mother had been. One harrowing account describes a man who bought a woman and her young daughter, only to send the daughter back after a week because she ate too much. 5. Violence didn't always end. Not every buyer was rescuing a woman. Some wanted a servant. Some wanted a submissive partner. Some wanted ownership. There were recorded cases where the new household was worse, the new man more cruel, the new walls more suffocating. Imagine escaping one cage only to find another, darker, quieter, more controlling, because now your suffering belonged to a man who felt entitled to you by payment. 6. Society blamed the woman, always. No matter who initiated the sale, community gossip targeted her. She must be troublesome. She must be wanting. She must have deserved it. Victorian's judgment cut deeper than any rope. But this wasn't the end. Wife selling didn't just damage the women. It reshaped entire families, neighborhoods, and generations. And when the press became obsessed with reporting these sales, the scandal exposed a truth the British government could no longer ignore. What happened next changed everything, and you'll see it in the next part. By the mid-1800s, something unexpected happened. Wife selling had been part of working-class life for generations. A quiet shame the upper class pretended didn't exist. But now Victorian Britain was obsessed with newspapers. Every scandal, every crime, every strange marketplace ritual ended up in print. And reporters loved wife-selling stories. They wrote about them with drama, mockery, and sensationalism, turning private tragedy into public entertainment. Headlines screamed things like, "Woman sold for a shilling and a supper," Wife led to market with a halter, purchased by local farmer. Husband disposes of spouse for beer. These stories spread across the country, from London to Manchester to Yorkshire, from poor villagers to wealthy readers sipping tea in polished drawing rooms. And suddenly, the Victorian public, so proud of its moral reputation, couldn't look away. The truth horrified them. Readers were shocked to learn that women were still being sold in open-air markets. Crowds treated it like entertainment, police ignored it, families accepted it. Children watched their mothers auctioned off like animals. For a society obsessed with decency, wife-selling made Britain look backward, barbaric, almost medieval. Some newspapers tried to expose the problem. Others treated it like a grotesque joke. Either way, the more people read, the angrier they became. Church leaders were furious. Priests saw wife sales as an attack on marriage, a shameful public sin, a threat to the moral order. They preached against it from pulpits, calling it the degradation of womanhood and the corruption of the working class. But even priests admitted something uncomfortable. The government had created this problem. By making divorce impossible for ordinary people, they had pushed the poor into desperate solutions. For the first time, public rage wasn't just aimed at the husbands who sold their wives. It was aimed at the lawmakers who trapped women in broken, dangerous marriages. Politicians could no longer pretend it wasn't happening. Newspaper reports embarrassed Parliament. Foreign observers mocked Britain for being civilized on paper, but medieval in practice. And then, something even more damaging happened. Some wife-selling cases involved middle-class families, not farmers, not miners, not drunk husbands from slums, respectable families, people who attended church, paid taxes, and had social influence. This shattered the class-based excuse that wife-selling was a poor man's custom. It exposed the real truth. Victorian marriage laws were failing everyone, not just the poor. Newspapers demanded reform. Activists pushed for women's rights. Social critics wrote angry essays, calling wife-selling a national humiliation. And for the first time in history, the British government felt pressured to change something they had ignored for more than a century. But the shift didn't start with new laws. It started with one case, a single-wife sale, so shocking that it forced the entire country to reconsider everything they believed about marriage, class, and morality. That case is coming next. It happened in 1832, a year that would burn itself into Britain's memory. By then, wife-selling wasn't unusual. People were used to hearing about women traded for ale, tobacco, or a few coins. But this time, the woman wasn't poor. She wasn't uneducated. She wasn't trapped in a filthy, crumbling cottage on the edge of town. She was respectable, middle class. A woman with status, manners, and a reputation to protect. And that changed everything. The woman's name was Mary Ann. Her husband, Henry, was a well-known cattle dealer with a steady income, a good home, and a place in his community. They weren't wealthy, but they were comfortable. People saw them as a couple above the common scandals of working-class markets. But their marriage was falling apart. Arguments turned into cold silence. Resentment turned into bitterness. Henry couldn't afford the one thing that might end it peacefully: a legal divorce. So he turned to the same brutal tradition used by the poorest men in England. He announced publicly that he intended to sell his wife. At first, neighbors thought it was a joke. A middle-class man selling a middle-class woman? It's impossible, unthinkable, scandalous. But Henry was serious. On market day, he led Mary Ann into town, not by force, but by arrangement. She walked beside him with quiet dignity, wearing her best dress, determined not to let shame break her. A crowd swarmed immediately. People elbowed each other, whispering, "Is that really her? Has he gone mad?" "This isn't a farmyard. It's a lady." And then the unbelievable happened. A wealthy man stepped forward to buy her. Not a miner, not a factory worker, not a drunken farmer. A well-dressed, educated man in full view of the entire town offered money for her. Exactly 1 shilling. A symbolic price, not a real one. It was a message. The law gives you no freedom. I will. The sale was done. Henry handed her over. The buyer took her arm gently, not like property, but like a woman he respected. And the news exploded. This was no longer a poor man's shame. This was a national embarrassment. Newspapers across Britain published the story with outrage. Foreign journalists mocked Britain's hypocrisy, claiming to be the world. Its most civilized empire while selling women like cattle in its markets. How could a middle-class man treat marriage this way? How could a respectable woman allow herself to be sold? How could the police simply watch? The scandal forced the nation to ask a terrifying question. If even the middle class had to resort to wife selling, what did that say about the state of British marriage? Parliament felt the pressure. Church leaders demanded action. Reformers used the case to argue that women needed legal protection, not humiliation. This single sale cracked the Victorian illusion that society was fair, moral, and civilized. But the reforms that followed weren't enough to stop the suffering, not right away. Because as public outrage grew, something else happened. Wife selling became a form of entertainment for spectators, and what crowds did next will make your stomach turn. As the husband marched his wife toward the marketplace, the crowd didn't look away in shame. They cheered. They laughed. They treated what should have been a moment of deep personal tragedy as cheap public entertainment. Street vendors moved closer, sensing profit. Children climbed onto barrels just to get a better look. For many Victorians, this bizarre ritual wasn't shocking. It was Saturday entertainment. The man pulled his wife by the rope around her waist, a rope she had no legal power to refuse. Behind them walked the buyer, the man who intended to take her home. For him, this wasn't love. It was a transaction. A chance to acquire a partner without courting, without permission, without consequence. Simply had to outbid the others. The husband climbed onto a wooden crate and shouted over the noise, "A good, strong woman can cook and clean. Who'll have her?" Some cheered. Others jeered. A few threw coins on the ground as jokes. The wife kept her head down, tears falling onto the dirt road. A woman being sold didn't automatically mean she was unwanted. Sometimes she pleaded to be bought by a kinder man just to escape a violent husband. But for many like her, this was a nightmare she couldn't escape. A man in a leather apron shouted his offer, 5 shillings. Another yelled for 6. Then someone offered 7 and a pint of gin, making the crowd roar. But standing in the back was a quiet man with muddy boots and a serious face. He raised his hand and offered 10 shillings. The crowd fell silent. That was more than double the usual price. Everyone watched the husband's face twist in surprise and suspicion. Why would this stranger pay so much for a woman others mocked? What did he want with her? And more importantly, what did he know? The husband didn't like the way the stranger stared at him. Calm, unwavering, almost disgusted. But money was money. He nodded. The rope was passed to the new owner. The wife didn't move. She just stared at her buyer as if trying to understand why a complete stranger had stepped into her life. He leaned in and whispered a sentence that made her gasp. "You don't belong to him anymore. You never did." Before she could ask what he meant, the crowd erupted again, but not from excitement. For men wearing official badges pushed through the people, heading straight toward the husband and the stranger. Slowly stepped aside, because this was no ordinary buyer. He wasn't there for a wife. He was there to expose a crime. The crowd scattered as the 4 officials closed in on the husband. Their boots hit the cobblestones with purpose. Not the casual stroll of constables, but the determined march of men who knew exactly what they were looking for. The husband's face turned pale. "What's this about?" he stammered. One of the officers unrolled a folded sheet of paper stamped with the seal of the local magistrate. "You are under arrest for bigamy, fraud, and illegal sale of a married woman." Gasps rippled through the market. Even in Victorian England, where men sold wives like livestock, there were limits. A man could perform the ritual only if both husband and wife agreed, and only if the wife had not been sold before. But this man had sold 2 wives before her. Both disappeared. No trace, no record. He wasn't just a desperate husband. He was a trafficker, hiding under a tradition people blindly accepted. The wife trembled as the officers grabbed him. She had lived with this man for years, but she had never seen him look afraid. Not until now. Tried to pull away, shouting to the crowd, "This is legal. Y'all saw it." She agreed to it. But the stranger, the quiet man who had paid 10 shillings, stepped forward and spoke loudly, firmly, so everyone could hear. She didn't agree, and neither did the ones before her. "You forged the witnesses and pocketed the money." The crowd turned on the husband instantly. Gears replaced laughter. Stones and rotten fruit flew through the air. The officers dragged him away before the mob tore him apart. His wife stood frozen, trying to understand how her nightmare had suddenly ended. The stranger approached her gently. "Who are you?" she whispered. He removed the mud-stained cap from his head. "My name is Roderick Hale. I work with the parish as a registrar. And with a few men who investigate cases like yours." She stared, confused. "Cases like mine?" Roderick nodded. "Men who use wife-selling to hide abuse or to disappear women. Most people think these auctions are harmless. A tradition, just a way to end a marriage." He paused, voice tightening. "But I've seen what men like him do." Her eyes filled with tears, not from sadness, but from something she hadn't felt in years. Safety. Roderick offered her the rope that once bound her. She hesitated, then dropped it into a puddle, letting the muddy water swallow it whole. A small crowd remained, their faces no longer entertained, but ashamed, realizing how easily they had cheered for cruelty disguised as custom. Roderick turned to leave, but she grabbed his sleeve. "What happens now?" she asked softly. He met her eyes. "Now, you get a real choice. A real life. Papers will be in your favor. You're free. Free." A word she had never truly understood, till this moment. She stepped away from the marketplace. The whispers began. Stories spread. Not just about a woman sold like cattle, but about the man who uncovered the ugly truth behind Victorian wife markets. A truth most people never knew, but would never forget.